You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 26th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Is Donald Trump's protection racketeers' approach to Ukraine about to pay off? Have South Koreans rediscovered their enthusiasm for making more South Koreans? And how to get paid for suffering through advertising? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Latika Burke and Michael Peel will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical series considers an incident literally named after today's date, which made it easier. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Latika Burke, writer-at-large for The Nightly in Australia, and also Michael Peel, science editor at the Financial Times. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Latika, first of all, you are about to return to our mutual shared homeland to watch Australia's democracy in action.
To the native shores, yes, that's right. Booking flights as we speak. Well, not literally, but after we speak. The Australian election, we think it's probably going to be called on March 9, which incidentally is my birthday. And that would
Is that a coincidence?
I hope. I did text the PM and say, could you just hurry up and call this. And then we think the election will be April 12, and it's going to be quite a blockbuster election, I think. So I'll look forward to dialing into you from Australia, Andrew, and giving you some updates, because it's going to test my theory, which we spoke about before the end of last year, about whether left-wing governments are becoming one-term governments, as we saw in Germany last week.
Well, indeed so. I mean, but I think there is a lesson there, Latika, is there not, for the rest of the world in the length of that Australian election campaign? Just knock the whole thing over in a month. I don't know what the Americans are doing.
Absolutely. I love a sharp, quick campaign, and this campaign I'm actually going to be back on the campaign bus, so I'm actually really looking forward to it, not just for a bit of sunshine, but to see some of the most beautiful parts of Australia that honestly you would not necessarily pay to go and see yourself, but if you're on a campaign, best way to see it.
Michael, you are shortly venturing somewhere closer but significantly less warm.
Yes, I'm off to Sweden soon, and we'll be charting the fallout from the Trump administration's the changes it's been making to science, and the massive waves this is creating internationally, funding cuts, institutions, websites coming down if their data they publish is said to be linked to DEI policies or any kind of equality. And so this is creating reverberations everywhere. So Sweden obviously has its own sort of very distinguished scientific institutions and home of the Nobel Prizes as well. So a great place to take the temperature of some of the fallout that this is having.
Are they or other European countries, though, anticipating something of an exodus from the United States? Because the brain drain that may be encouraged could be an opportunity for other nations.
So this is an excellent question, and certainly one that we're exploring. And the answer is certainly yes. And there are anecdotal stories of US researchers at various levels of seniority sort of exploring opportunities in Europe. But on the other hand, some of the countries, including this one, including the UK, who have pretensions to taking some of perhaps US researchers who are sort of fleeing the US, are complicated by their own policies. And for example, a lot of science and technology people in the UK say the visa system is a big deterrent. It's expensive by world standards, and also there are rules that are very restrictive about family members who can come with researchers and science experts, and that's creating a bit of a chill, which is a deterrent from the UK.
And just before we move on, Michael, is there an imminent paperback release of any kind that you would like to make passing reference to at this time?
Well, very funny you should mention that, Andrew,
I thought it might be.
I have just published the paperback of my book, What Everyone Knows About Britain, brackets, except the British, fully updated after the election in the UK last year. And well, fortunately, in editing it, the judgments within seem to stand up reasonably well to the passage of time. But obviously, there's a sense that, with the arrival of President Trump for his second term, that everything's on fast forward. So it may need another update.
No, it's too close for that sort of retrospective angst. The trick is to go back to a book you wrote 10 or 20 years ago and read it again. It's just, oh my God, what the hell is this crap? At which point you're vaguely relieved that actually nobody bought it. But we will start with Ukraine and some suggestion that some sort of deal may be in the offing whereby Ukraine purchases the previous and continuing support of the United States via a deal involving Ukrainian mineral resources. US President Donald Trump has said he expects his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, to sign such an agreement in Washington, D.C. in the next few days, though as of this broadcast, Zelensky appears to be hedging somewhat, insisting that he wants the text to include American security guarantees. Latika, that detail in particular, does this suggest that Zelensky is not terribly enthused about the idea of banking on the Europeans, and that he realises that unless America is holding the line, you don't really have a line to hold?
Yes, because of course the ultimate audience here is one man in the Kremlin, and that's Vladimir Putin. And the only thing that the assessment goes, and I think this is correct, that will deter Vladimir Putin from trying again in Ukraine is if the Americans under Trump say very loudly and clearly don't go there. That's not a message we have necessarily heard, of course, from the Trump administration. So I am actually very apprehensive and worried about what's about to be signed here. Let's wait and see what emerges on Friday when President Zelensky goes to DC to meet Trump. But I think there are many signs here that the Ukrainians are being pushed and badgered and pressured into signing a deal that may be substandard for their own national security interests and, of course, Europe's interests.
If there is, however, Michael, a constant to Zelensky's career as a comedian, a businessman and as a politician, and this comes up particularly well in Simon Schuster's excellent biography, The Showman, which I do recommend to anybody who wishes to better understand the Ukrainian president. He is an incredibly stubborn and determined man, occasionally at various points to his own personal or professional detriment. He doesn't seem like somebody who's about to get bounced into something by Donald Trump at this late stage, or mightn't he have a choice?
Well, the last 3 years have certainly proved the truth of what you're saying. But on the other hand, there's a power relationship here that no amount of personal qualities can change. And I think it's worth taking a step back just to say that, what the Trump administration here is doing is essentially altering the deal in a very fundamental way. It gave this aid to Ukraine. There was no mention of these strings being attached. And then suddenly it's decided that actually Ukraine needs to compensate it for some or all of that money. That's a pretty fundamental change, which of course will add to the huge sort of seismic alteration in the way that countries in the West and outside are looking at the US administration and asking the question of, well, is there any deal that you can trust it to honour if it's liable to changes of this magnitude post hoc?
Latika, Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has spoken of this not as the straightforward protection racketeering it initially appeared to be, but he's talking about an investment fund that will be managed on equal terms by the United States and Ukraine. If that was the arrangement, would that necessarily be terrible? I mean, it happens all the time that countries invest in another country's natural resources and share the profits from their extrication.
Yeah, I think there's room and ample reason to hold out and see if something novel and creative that serves both parties' interests here can be thrashed out and will indeed be signed. My great concern is that jointly rebuilding Ukraine, investing in Ukraine's long-term security, helping Ukraine with what comes next has not really been in any of the factors of Donald Trump's thinking. Certainly none of his musings have expressed any motivation about trying or wanting to restore Ukraine to its sovereignty, restore its sovereignty and rebuild its pride and its security. And in fact, what you have is actually the opposite. You have Donald Trump consistently saying we want payback and more. You know, this is, to me, a president that looks at Ukraine and sees it not as a democratic ally to be upheld and not as a very important piece in a huge geopolitical puzzle that needs to be put in the right place for all of our interests. But he looks at it like a colonialist looks at a piece of land. He wants to grab, he wants to extract, he wants to plunder. And hell hath no fury, like a man scorned by Volodymyr Zelensky, quite clearly.
He has returned to this theme a few times, Michael. There's the idea that that America wants its money back. It is not clear from his pronouncements that he understands how much money America has actually spent. He deliberately or otherwise, he wildly overinflates the amount by orders of magnitude. And he either doesn't understand or pretends not to understand that quite a lot of that money was actually spent in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of many questions and criticisms that can be made of the US approach, and this and people are doing so. And I think the other question is, well, there's this big story about the metals wealth of Ukraine, and how substantive is that actually? I mean, clearly President Trump is very taken by the idea of rare earths. I mean, the name is obviously suggestive of things which are.
I would, if any American White House pool reporters are listening, dinner on me if one of them actually asks him to explain what rare earths are.
Yeah, and they are important, of course, and especially for new green technologies, the magnets used in them, wind turbines, and so on. However, it's not at all clear that Ukraine has the sort of level of wealth that certainly comments by President Trump and others have suggested. And also, it's part of a complicated supply chain which involves having to process and purify these metals, and China controls a lot of that. And so it's not just a question of having the stuff in the ground. There are other parts of the process to bear in mind, and it's not at all clear that the US administration has considered and made a plan to cover that complexity.
Well, to South Korea now, where there is tentatively good news for anyone who has been concerned about a potential future lack of South Koreans. The country's infamously laggardly birth rate has ticked somewhat up for the first time in 9 years. 238,300 South Koreans were welcomed to the world last year, up 8,300 on the year before, a rise attributed to new financial incentives for newlyweds and better provision of childcare. Nevertheless, South Korea's present population of circa 51 million people is still more or less on course to halve by the turn of the 22nd century. Michael, you're our resident science boffin at this evening's symposium. Why is it so often axiomatically held that declining population is bad?
So, I mean, it's a very good question to come back to the fundamentals in that way. And there are obviously people who have a very ideological view that, societies should always be expanding, women should be having children and so on. And I think that a lot of researchers in this field would take a different view and say, well, it is the birth rate is what it is. It reflects choices people make, and it's a fundamental human right that people should be able to have as many or as few children as they like. And while it's legitimate for states to put in place policies to try to encourage more births, in the end, these are individual decisions that people are making. And if the sort of conclusion in the end is, well, the world is in a long-term sort of fertility decline, and over time that will lead to a population decline, then maybe we need to think about organising ourselves socially and economically a bit differently. And I think in the South Korean case, we need to look at the effects of this over time, because there have been other countries like Finland that have tried some policies as a pilot, and there's been an initial bump in the birth rate, but then it's disappeared very quickly. And there's not really any country out there which has tried to promote the birth rate with financial or other incentives that can actually point to a long-term change as a result of that. It's a puzzle that nobody's been able to solve.
Well, there is one solution, Latika, which South Korea and Japan, for another, are both notably disinclined to consider, which is that other people are available, by which I mean immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very difficult conversation that many, many jurisdictions are grappling with. By the way, so is China. I think it's an irrefutable truth that once you start educating women, they choose to have fewer children and choose lives that don't necessarily revolve around family and birthing. I would also say I know plenty of women who would have liked to have had children but simply could not find a suitable partner they thought would be reliable and in their judgment a good father. So I think it is a very complicated story why modern people aren't having families like they used to. And I think some of it is going to be related to tax and costs and housing and cost of living and things like this. But I do also think you just cannot escape that there's just simply more choice for women. And hey presto, maybe we're seeing what women of 100 years ago might have done if they'd had the same choice. We're seeing that now.
I mean, are there anything... I mean, all of that is obviously the case because when countries... We've seen this happen all over the world over and over again, Michael. When countries become wealthier, when their women are permitted more options in life, this tends to be the consequence. But if governments are concerned about declining birth rates, and almost all governments profess to be, is it just as simple as actually trying to find ways to make it easier to have children? I mean, certainly here in the United Kingdom, I'm sure all of us have met women or know women who are in the situation where they have children, are trying to continue their job, but literally lose money by going to work because of the childcare costs. Yes,
absolutely. And those are clearly big deterrents. And, there are certainly practical things that can and should be done to make it easier for people to have children. But also, as Latika says, I mean, there's this fundamental point that, as societies become more educated and richer, women tend to have fewer children. And of course, part of that is their own choice. Sometimes it might be circumstances. I mean, there are clearly sort of interesting questions about, in the digital age, how are people meeting each other with the same frequency that they might have previous generations? So there's a lot to grapple with and a lot to unpack here. And as I say, it's a question that nobody has really got to the bottom of. And I think it's also an underrated question, an underrated trend in terms of looking at the world. That China, you quoted as an example. Well, yes, clearly there are trends to do with increasing education and wealth in China, but what there's also been is 30 years of the one-child policy, which is going to have a massive effect in the coming decades. And, these are going to have big effects on China and other countries socially and economically.
I think one of the solutions is to focus on the people who do want children. And perhaps one way is to encourage those who have one, how could we get you to have two? Those who have two, how could we get you to have three? As opposed to trying to convince...
The Soviet Union used to award medals at certain increments.
Hungary actually has some pretty wild policies on this around once you have five, I think it is, children, or it's a huge number anyway, where the tax incentives really drastically change. But I also think childcare is a huge thing, and I think we would have to look at making a kind of voucher or universal childcare system available at some point in time if we are to have women feeling that they can choose amongst the range of options available to them and not just it's one or the other.
Well, to Switzerland, which despite a policy of positively militant neutrality and having not involved itself in any proper sort of dust-up since the internal Catholics versus Protestants punch-up that was the Sonderbund War of 1847... deep breath, maintains a handy military and conscription. Swiss national service is no whimsical skip through the Edelweisses. In general, male citizens do 18 weeks of basic training, then 6 3-week refresher stints during 9 years as a reservist. However, some Swiss dual nationals are exploiting a loophole which holds that if you do your stint in your other home country, you're off the hook. And French passport holders can knock it off with a single day of induction. Michael, not unsurprisingly, at least one Swiss politician wants to change this. I mean, it does seem straightforwardly unfair, but if you are going to have dual citizens, this is the sort of thing that's going to happen.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it sort of goes to the deeper question of is national service justifiable? And, obviously different countries have different views according to their geographies and histories and so on. But, this is a debate that obviously crops up in the UK from time to time as well, including the proposals by the Conservatives before the last election. But I mean, one point that's quite often not sort of perhaps sort of highlighted enough is that there are a lot of people in the military who, don't think this is necessarily a good idea.
They're generally not keen.
Yes, so there's this sort of assumption that, well, this will create a fighting force that, generals will then be able to deploy, but that's very far from being the case.
I mean, as Michael notes, Latika, this was floated by the Conservatives in the last general election. It wasn't taken tremendously seriously. Do you think the Tories would actually have floated that one, though, if they thought they had a chance in hell of winning that election, or was it just the kind of mad, desperate stuff when you're going to get walloped and you're just trying to attract attention?
It was more popular than you think, though. I mean, there were that policy, I talked to people at the time, that policy did rate very well on the doors because, of course, lots of parents said, back in my day, we were tougher and, gee, I'd like to see my kid, have some values and life skills beaten into them. So it actually did have some electoral benefit, but, of course, you might remember that it all went spectacularly haywire because of the D-Day kind of incident where Sunak left the ceremony. So I think we would have had a better discussion about it had it not been for the political context of that. Interestingly, this has been re-asked of the Conservatives this week in a lot of the defence discussion talk happening in the UK. And James Cartledge, who is now the Shadow Defence Secretary, was asked about this and didn't exactly full-throatedly back it as a policy idea, but he did also hold open the option. I think it is something a lot of us will be discussing within the next 12 months. There is certainly a tenser geopolitical situation than we're seeing, and it will naturally require people, and I think you saw a flavour of this in the UK yesterday with the Prime Minister Keir Starmer announcing that he would raise defence spending, just beginning to start talking about this is going to need a whole of society effort here. That might not necessarily be national service, but it might require other things. I mean, in Ukraine, for example, ordinary people help build drones. Maybe we have to redefine what this sort of national service could look like. But I do think we will have roles and we'll be talking at a greater degree about what civic engagement looks like.
And how many of these people, Latika, on the doorstep who were in favour of national service were in that age group that they had not done national service themselves and they were too old to be called to do it.
It suddenly becomes one of those things you see the merits of around your 40th birthday.
I like to call these the kids should get off their phones policy.
But Michael, is there a case for it beyond the purely military one? Because advocates of it suggest that it does have other benefits, that people learn how to do things. They learn to interact with fellow citizens who they might otherwise never have met. It does promote an amount of social cohesion. And many years ago, I did do a story in Switzerland on conscription for Monocle magazine, and I met a bunch of Air Force conscripts. And Switzerland, as we've been discussing, is a special case. Everybody knows it's a fact of life, or at least young Swiss men know it's a fact of life. And I remember talking to a couple of them who said, yeah, look, you spend your entire teens whining about the fact that you have to do this, but you've got to do it. But we've been here for a few weeks and yeah, he said you turn up, you go through a few basic things. I remember this kid who was like 18 or 19 saying, and eventually someone says, right, that there is your helicopter. The men who fly that helicopter are now your responsibility. And he said at that point you realise I'd better take this seriously.
Yeah, and I mean the idea of things that teach people skills and are social is clearly something that's very, very powerful and important. But there are non-military ways of doing that, right? I mean, the Scouts, for example, and other organisations to get people out and about.
There is a civilian option in Switzerland which takes longer.
Right, and but the idea, which Latika, you also nodded at there, of initiatives which cultivate some kind of social ethic, I think are things that people are thinking about increasingly, and certainly something that in societies which are becoming increasingly atomized in many ways are to be encouraged, but they must be constructive and good for the people who are doing them, and not a sort of burden or an imposition.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Taiwan last year and was talking to some young guys about their national service. I mean, the stories ranged from I left not knowing how to shoot a gun to I swept a room, I mean, the quality of the national service does actually have to matter if people are going to go down this route. But, I mean, conscription is so much more a norm in so many countries, Andrew, as you frequently discuss here on Monocle. I think sometimes we forget how normal it is actually to a lot of people in the world.
And how normal it has been across most of Europe until really quite recently. But we will go now to India, where one determined citizen has struck a blow on behalf of all of those of us who may have yelped from the darkened cinema stalls during the interminable advertisements preceding the main feature, words to the effect of, "Get on with it." My apologies to everyone else at the Ingmar Bergman Festival. A moviegoer from Bangalore became so vexed by the trailer marathon to which he was subjected that he filed suit against the cinema chain in question and won. The court awarded him the equivalent of 450 quid for having his time wasted and another £45 for mental agony. Latika, this precedent is going to bankrupt not just every cinema chain on earth, but pretty much everything on earth. If we can hop into people for 500 quid a go every time they waste half an hour of our time and annoy us, I mean, like that's the collapse of capitalism.
I mean, I want a refund for the 50 minutes of mental agony I spent on hold to Royal Mail last Friday because the postier left me a card with illegible handwriting so I couldn't rebook my delivery online. I mean, it was just nuts. Absolutely. I love this story so much. This guy is just sitting there working himself up into such a rage that he files for mental agony.
Well, you'll be laughing the other side of your face, Latika, when we all get sued by somebody who's been feels like this program has wasted their time.
Indeed, it's put me on my mettle for my performance on this show, I must say.
I mean, where does it end? Michael, where are you on this? Does this man have a case, or should the court just have said, seriously, mate, on the subject of wasting everybody's time? I mean, come on. This is a bit risible.
Yes, it's hard to see this surviving an appeal. But as you say, I mean, the precedent would be astronomical sums being paid out. But I sympathise with the impulse, but perhaps not the remedy on this.
I mean, on the flight back from my recent trip to Australia, Latika, I watched Napoleon. I'm coming for Ridley Scott, I can tell you.
Was it that bad?
Oh, it's excruciating.
Yeah.
And that's like 3.5 hours long. So if I do the maths here, hang on, Ridley Scott owes me 1,750 quid.
Yeah.
That's quite a bill.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the plane ticket.
Well, yeah, it actually is.
Yeah.
He will be hearing from my people. Latika, you mentioned the Royal Mail. I have written in one of Monocle's excellent free daily emails my proposal for dealing with that particular irritant. Genuinely past 5 minutes, I think the clock should start running. I think the company should be charged by the minute.
I could not agree more, Andrew.
So I've solved that problem. What about cinema ads, though? Michael, are they a necessary evil? Should people just, suck it up?
We do have Ridley Scott on the other line, by the way.
Well,
yeah, I mean, cinemas have had a tough time since COVID, right? And so, they've got to make money, and it's not unreasonable that they should show adverts. And I'm old enough to remember, at least in the UK, when they had not just adverts, but these very quirky pre-features, like short films of 5 or 10 minutes.
Really?
Which ran before the main feature. Yeah, I'm that old, Latika. But
I've never heard of
no, they used to have those in Australian cinemas back when you could barely hear the feature for people rolling Jaffas down the wooden floors.
Everything in moderation.
Yeah, the Jaffa for non-Australian listeners is a sort of chocolate sweet with a hard orange flavoured hard coating, and if you a handful of those down a wooden floor during the romantic scenes, those were the days. Latika Burke and Michael Peel, thank you both for joining us. And finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical lecture considers another entry in the lengthy lexicon of botched coups d'état. There is, yes, a clue in the name. The February 26th incident was, yes, an incident which occurred on February 26th. February 26th, 1936, to be specific, in Tokyo, to be even more so. The February 26th incident was, very broadly, an attempted coup d'etat. The song you're hearing served as a sort of soundtrack. On the date in question, its composer, an excitable Japanese naval officer called Mikami Taku, was serving a sentence for his role in an earlier mutiny. Like all attempted coups, the February 26th incident was richly endowed with elements of farce and tragedy, hubris and nemesis. It is, when you pause to consider it, quite a thing to array a relatively small group of people and steel yourselves to seize an entire country. While the motives and the protagonists are rarely admirable, they are much more often indeed malevolent and/or deranged, grudging points do have to be awarded for audacity. The orchestrators of the February 26th incident were a faction of hot-headed young officers in the Imperial Japanese Army, agitated by the belief that Japan was insufficiently nationalistic, militaristic, imperialist and authoritarian. Given that Japan was, at the time, ruled by an emperor regarded as a literal god and was presiding with notable brutality over an empire including Taiwan, Korea, a scattering of Pacific islands, a small sliver of Russia, and a large chunk of China, these soldiers were clearly a difficult bunch to please. There had been previous brouhahas associated with this hardcore crew and/or their fellow travellers. 2 abortive coups in 1931, another in 1932 in which the Prime Minister of the time was murdered by sailors, another in 1934. Spend much time with Japan's history of this period, and you start wondering whether those in charge finally ordered the raid on Pearl Harbor to keep this rowdy crowd occupied. The February 26th incident was better organised than its predecessors. Its perpetrators had absorbed from previous failures the key maxim which must underpin any such endeavour, that one about "come at the king, best not miss." That said, the king, Emperor Hirohito, was not their quarry as such. As far as the plotters were concerned, they were acting in the emperor's interests, whether he knew it or liked it or not. They took the time to compose a manifesto explaining themselves.
Recently, evil and selfish people have encroached upon the authority of the emperor, caused the utmost misery to our people, and brought humiliation by foreign powers upon our country.
The times and the place change, but the rhetoric stays the same. All authoritarian movements are girded by paranoid self-pity. They struck in the early hours of a snowy night. Claiming the title of the Army of the Righteous, they had perhaps 1,400 troops under their command. They swiftly seized what should be the key targets of any competent coup: the Prime Minister's residence, the Ministry of War, the police headquarters, the offices of the Asahi Shimbun. All boxes ticked: political power, military power, the law, the press. They also demonstrated themselves willing to act with the ruthlessness often necessary to make a coup stick and deter any counter-revolutionary elements who might fancy their chances. 7 senior officials were explicitly marked for death and 3 were murdered, including 2 former prime ministers and a general. The serving Prime Minister, Okada Keisuke, escaped thanks to the courage of his bodyguards and an error of the insurrectionists, who shot dead his brother-in-law, believing him to be their target. The rebels did not have the technology available to record their exploits and had to wait until 1989 for someone to make a film about it. 4 Days of Snow and Blood by Hideo Gosha, who as a patriotic teenager during World War II had volunteered for service as a kamikaze pilot but was spared by Japan's surrender. As the title of 4 Days of Snow and Blood hints, the revolt launched on this day 89 years ago unravelled, not least because Hirohito, the emperor whose honour the rebels believed themselves to be upholding, was unimpressed, and their attempted seizure of the imperial palace foundered. A few of the ringleaders shot themselves. 19 faced the firing squad after extremely brisk trials. Dozens more were imprisoned or sacked. The army manoeuvred swiftly to consolidate control over nominally civilian branches of government, a sort of counter-coup to the attempted coup, as noted in a cable of March 19, 1936, by well-connected US Ambassador Joseph C. Grew.
While the changes desired by the insurgents have not all come about, measures toward effecting them gradually are under definite consideration.
It is uncertain how much consolation it ever was to the surviving putschists, but they kind of got what they wanted, i.e. a country which more served the military than the other way around. There would, a few years later, be consequences. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. And that is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Latika Burke and Michael Peel. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.